So I've got a question to ask to all of you. Is insurance the only way of managing the risk? The answer is no. So in which you transfer the risk to some other company, that is a policy holder will transfer the risk to an insurance company. That is one way of managing the risk. But there are some alternative methods of managing the risk. And today we are going to discuss exactly the same. The first one which I am going to talk about, one of the ways of managing the risk is risk avoidance. So in this situation, you will avoid the entire exposure to the risk itself, right? Now, for example, you may not want to deal with property, with person, or you may not want to get into an activities where you feel that the risk is very high or your exposure is very high. Now, one more example is, let's say there is a manufacturing unit, they want to transfer the entire manufacturing unit to some other third person. Why? Because they do not want to bear the certain amount of risks which are involved in manufacturing. One more example that I will give you is, one may not want to step out of their house just because by traveling abroad they might want to feel that there is always a chances of illness, the fear of illness in fact. So they will try to avoid traveling outside. So these are some of the examples of risk avoidance. So this way of managing the risk is considered to be a very negative approach towards managing the risk, because we need to take certain amount of risk and there is no way that we can completely avoid the risk. And if at all we are avoiding to get into such activities, we may lose out the entire opportunity itself of our overall progress. So hence we need to take certain amount of risk and we need to move forward. Otherwise it will hinder all our progresses. So, but this is one of the way of managing the risk. That is a risk avoidance. Now let's go to the one more way of managing the risk, that is a risk retention. So risk retention, I will call it as a self insurance. So any loss situation or an adverse situation comes in, you are retaining that risk with yourself. So risk retention, I can also call it as a self-insurance mechanism, because you all need to bear the risk for any kind of loss exposure. So this is one way of managing the risk. The other alternative ways, and I can say this is the better practical approach than avoiding risk, is by managing the risk by taking the reduction and control measures. Right, instead of trying to completely avoid the risk, this method practically sounds very reliable and it is the best way of managing the risk. Now for example, in situation where you want to apply risk reduction and control, you want to drive a car, always wear a seat belt, always wear a helmet. So by wearing a seat belt or by wearing a helmet, you are actually reducing the impact of an adverse situation. In case if there is an accident happens, it may happen or it may not happen also, but the impact to some extent will be reduced because you are taking the measures of risk reduction and control. So one more classic example that I will give you is, by spraying the chemical, there could be a possibility of a spread of malaria. So I cannot live with all the fear of having to get infected by the malaria, but what I can do is I can spray the chemicals and reduce the impact of that. Right, that is one way of managing the risk by way of reduction and control. See, the other examples are training all your employees on regularly on fire drills and making them aware of what all the possibility ways are there in case if there is a risk situation arises, right? And in case if your employees are working where in a situation they are dealing with the chemical, always wear the gloves and the face shields. so that you are protected. I mean, you can also continue doing your work, but in case if there is an adverse situation happens, there is some control measures that you are taking. So we've talked about risk avoidance, we've talked about risk retention, we've talked about risk reduction and control. So there is another way of managing the risk is, in case if there is a risk happens, we need to be get prepared ourselves. That is a risk financing. So there are two ways of financing the risk. One is a self financing. The self financing again is a method wherein I will bear the entire cost of the loss. So this may not be suitable for a smaller kind of a individual or a smaller kind of a companies. This might be a suitable for a very large organization where the parent company is ready to bear the losses for their subsidiary companies. But for an individual, risk financing by way of self financing is not advisable at all, right? So then the other way of risk financing is the taking the adequate amount of insurance by way of transferring the risk to an insurance company. By this method of risk transfer, the entire unbearable cost will become bearable, and you will also be from an uncertain situation, you will arrive at a certain situation, and there will be a continuous peace of mind, right? So these are the different ways of risk management techniques that we have discussed today. So hope you got a clarity in understanding what are the different ways of managing the risk. So depending upon the situation that you are facing, you can decide whether the impact of the loss exposure is very high, very less, medium, moderate. On that situation, now you know how to take the measures of risk management. Either you avoid the risk retention is one of the method, or risk reduction or control, or you can also think of risk financing either through self financing or through the alternative way, and which is the best method is the transferring the risk to the insurance company. By way of, by doing a risk transfer, you will also have a peace of mind and you will have the certainty. So thank you so much. I hope the session was interesting, and we will come up with more on the risk management aspects in the next session. And do leave your comments in the comment section on a different ways of managing the risk and which one you are trying to manage the risk in a particular situation. Thank you all.